I've been debating whether or not to share this for a while now, but it's been eating at me, and maybe putting it out there will help. This all happened about a year ago, and to this day, I still don't have answers. But what I do know is that I'll never be able to look at apartment complexes the same way again. For context, I had just moved into this mid-range apartment building, Brookside Apartments. It wasn't the fanciest, but it had a decent view of the nearby park, a laundromat in the basement, and most importantly, rent I could afford. It was mostly quiet, with an occasional party here and there from the college kids down the hall. I thought I'd struck gold with this place. Turns out, I was wrong. It started one night around am. I was asleep when I heard this loud thud coming from above me. I live on the 3rd floor in apartment 3C, and the apartment above me, for C, was rented out to some guy named Mark. We'd exchanged a few hellos in passing, but that was it. Quiet guy, worked from home, kept to himself. I figured maybe he'd knocked something over or something. No big deal. But then I heard it again. Another thud. And then a scraping noise, like someone dragging furniture. I was half asleep, so I figured Mark was just moving stuff around late at night, and I tried to ignore it. It happened a couple more times that night but eventually stopped, and I passed out. The next morning, I ran into Mrs. Kowalski, the elderly lady who lived across the hall in 3B, on my way out. She was the nosy neighbor type, always poking around for gossip. "Did you hear those noises last night?" she asked, gripping her grocery bags tightly. "I heard them too. It sounded like someone was being thrown around." I laughed it off. Probably just Mark moving stuff around. Mrs. Kowalski squinted at me, then whispered, "I don't like him. Something's off about that boy." I didn't think much of it at the time. Old people tend to overthink things, right? But then the noises kept happening. Over the next few nights, I'd hear them around the same time: loud bangs, something heavy being dragged, and occasionally what sounded like muffled voices. At this point, I was starting to get annoyed. I even thought about knocking on his door to ask him to keep it down, but I didn't want to be that neighbor. Things took a turn about a week later. I was walking back from work, and I noticed that Mark's door was open a crack. That was weird. Mark never left his door open. Hell, I'd barely ever seen him outside his apartment. I knocked lightly on the door, calling out, "Mark, you okay?" No answer. I should have just walked away. Should have minded my own business. But curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open and took a step inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It wasn't the rotting, foul smell you'd expect from a murder scene, though I didn't know that at the time. It was more like something metallic. Like iron. The apartment was dimly lit, the blinds half drawn. It looked mostly normal at first glance: minimalist furniture, a TV, a couple of plants. But then I noticed the floor near the kitchen. There was a red stain, almost like someone had spilled wine, but the more I looked at it, the more I realized that wasn't wine. My heart started racing. I called out again, louder this time. "Mark." No response. I backed out of the apartment, my stomach twisting into knots. The logical part of me was telling myself that it was just my imagination, that it was probably nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I went back to my apartment and called the cops. I didn't know what else to do. When they arrived, I explained what I'd seen. 2 officers went up to check it out while I waited outside in the hall with Mrs. Kowalski peeking out from behind her door. About 10 minutes later, one of the cops came back down, his face pale. He radioed for backup. Turns out, Mark wasn't in his apartment. But there was blood. Lots of it. Enough that the cops were pretty sure something bad had happened. That's when things really started spiraling. The police questioned everyone in the building, but no one had seen Mark for a few days. The last time anyone had spotted him was about 5 days before the noises started. No one had heard anything unusual except me, and of course, Mrs. Kowalski, who swore she'd seen a suspicious-looking man hanging around the building recently. But honestly, she said that about anyone she didn't know. They searched Mark's apartment from top to bottom. No body, no weapon, no sign of a struggle aside from the blood. It was like he had just vanished. Over the next few weeks, things got even stranger. The noises stopped, but every so often, I'd catch the faintest hint of that metallic smell in the hallway near my apartment, almost like it was following me. Then one night, about a month after the initial incident, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were coming from the hall this time, not from upstairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone pacing back and forth. I got out of bed, my heart pounding, and pressed my ear to the door. And then I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, but I could have sworn I heard someone say my name. I threw open the door, but the hallway was empty. No one was there. I stood there, heart racing, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, but something deep inside me knew it wasn't. The police never found Mark. They eventually ruled his disappearance as suspicious but dropped the active investigation after a few months due to a lack of leads. The blood? They said it was inconclusive, but I knew better. Something happened in that apartment, and whatever it wasn't over. The final straw for me came a couple of weeks later. I was coming back from a late shift when I noticed something scrawled on my door. In what looked like red paint, or maybe something else, were two words. "You're next." I didn't wait around to find out what that meant. I packed up and moved out that same week. Haven't looked back since. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear those footsteps. We'll continue building from here into 15,000 characters. Expanding the story to reach the 15000 character mark involves adding more depth to the characters, expanding the eerie atmosphere, and detailing the events as they unravel. Here's the next section of The Murder in 3B. I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment across town after that, far away from Brookside. It was a quieter place, and I figured it would help me put the whole ordeal behind me. But things didn't quite work out that way. For the first couple of weeks, everything was fine. I had settled into my new apartment, started focusing more on work, and even began to sleep better. I was trying to convince myself that the entire situation had been a bizarre coincidence, a series of weird events that didn't really mean anything. Maybe Mark had just skipped town. Maybe the writing on my door was some cruel prank. I wanted so desperately to believe it was all in my head, that I could just move on with my life and forget about what had happened. But then the dreams started. They weren't like regular dreams, not in the way I'd experienced them before. These dreams were vivid, almost too real, and they always started the same way. I would find myself back in Brookside Apartments, standing in front of Mark's door. It was always slightly ajar, just like the day I'd found it open. Inside, the apartment was dimly lit, and that faint metallic smell hung in the air again, like something rotten lurking just out of sight. I'd walk inside, my feet heavy, my body moving almost on its own, as if I had no control over it. The red stain on the kitchen floor was there, larger and darker this time. I'd try to turn around, to leave, but something would pull me forward. My body would keep moving, deeper into the apartment, until I was standing right in front of the stain. And that's when I'd hear the footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, just like the ones I'd heard in the hallway. And then, without fail, a whisper would fill the air. Soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. "You're next." I'd wake up in a cold sweat every time, heart racing, my sheets twisted around me. The dreams were so real that I would lie awake for hours afterward, convinced that if I closed my eyes again, I'd be right back in that apartment. They happened almost every night for a month. I tried everything to make them stop: sleeping pills, therapy, even meditation, which I had never done before. Nothing worked. No matter what I did, the dreams kept coming back, and with each one, I felt the dread growing inside me. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I couldn't just let this thing consume me, not without knowing what had really happened to Mark. So, I did something I swore I'd never do. I went back to Brookside. I took a day off work and drove to the apartment complex. It felt strange being back there, like stepping into a nightmare that had bled into reality. The building looked exactly the same as it had the day I left, though it seemed quieter, almost deserted. Several apartments were empty now, their windows dark and vacant. I parked my car and walked up to the entrance, my stomach churning with nerves. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to be there. I needed to see it again. Maybe if I could just confront it, the dreams would stop. When I reached the third floor, I hesitated in front of my old apartment 3C. It looked so normal, so mundane. It was hard to believe that something so sinister had unfolded just a few feet away. I moved down the hall and stopped in front of Mark's old door. Apartment 4C.it was closed, of course. No sign of the faint crack or the eerie darkness I'd seen in my dreams. For a moment, I stood there, staring at the door, wondering what the hell I was even doing. I couldn't just walk in this time. The apartment had likely been rented out to someone else by now, and I didn't want to explain myself to the landlord or new tenants. But before I could walk away, I noticed something odd. There was a faint sound coming from inside the apartment. A soft thump, then another. My heart rate spiked. It was almost like those same noises I'd heard before, the thudding and scraping. I knocked lightly on the door, my knuckles barely grazing the wood. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I called out, feeling ridiculous. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear the noises again, but they had stopped. For a moment, I stood there, feeling stupid for thinking I could get some sort of closure by knocking on a door. But then, the door creaked open. It wasn't much, just a slight movement, like someone had nudged it from the other side. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello?" I said again, louder this time. Nothing. I should have left. I know I should have left. But I couldn't stop myself. My hand reached out, and before I knew it, I was pushing the door open and stepping inside. The apartment was empty. No furniture, no personal belongings, just bare walls and a hardwood floor. It looked like no one had lived there in months, maybe even longer. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with that metallic smell again, faint but unmistakable. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I took a few cautious steps inside. The layout was exactly as I remembered it from before: living room on the left, kitchen straight ahead. The red stain was still there, darker than ever, like a permanent scar on the floor. And then I heard it. The footsteps. They were faint at first, just like in the hallway outside my old apartment. Slow, methodical, getting louder with each step. They were coming from behind me. I turned around, my heart hammering in my chest, but the doorway was empty. No one was there. The footsteps stopped. I stood frozen in place, my breath coming in shallow, rapid bursts. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls growing tighter and tighter until I thought I was going to suffocate. I needed to get out of there. I needed to leave, right now. But just as I turned to run, I heard it again. "You're next." It wasn't a whisper this time. It was louder, clearer, as if someone was standing right behind me, breathing the words into my ear. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I bolted out of the apartment, my feet pounding against the floor as I ran down the hallway, through the stairwell, and out of the building. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, gasping for air, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I didn't go back to Brookside after that. I didn't need to. Whatever was happening there, whatever had happened to Mark, it wasn't just in that apartment. It had followed me. It was part of me now. The dreams didn't stop though. They got worse. Every night, I'd wake up in a panic, drenched in sweat, the sound of footsteps echoing in my ears. The whisper, the same words, over and over again. "You're next." I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever was haunting Mark's apartment, it had moved on. It had found someone new. And now, it's only a matter of time.